John had long felt that something in his life was amiss. He lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, and at first the solitude didn't bother him at all. But for the past few weeks, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. At first he attributed it to stress and overwork, but soon this feeling began to grow into something more terrifying. The first thing that caught his attention was a shadow that appeared in the corner of his bedroom. John noticed it by accident one night when he woke up in the middle of a dream. The shadow was unnaturally dense and still, even though the light source casting it was unclear. It remained in the corner as if watching him. John tried to find a rational explanation for this phenomenon. Perhaps it was just a play of light, he thought, or simply a reflection from something in the room. He rearranged the lamp, moved the furniture, but the shadow did not disappear. On the contrary, it began to seem more ominous to him, as if it were becoming deeper and darker with each passing day. A few days later, John began to notice that the shadow seemed to be moving. Not overtly, but somehow it shifted, changing its position on the wall. Sometimes it seemed to him that it had moved closer to his bed, sometimes that it had grown wider. He tried not to pay attention to it, attributing it to his imagination, but deep inside, fear was starting to take hold. One night, after a long day at work, John came home and immediately felt something was wrong. He walked into the bedroom and immediately noticed that the shadow had moved. Now it wasn't just in the corner of the room, but seemed to stretch along the wall, creeping closer to his bed. John's heart began to race, and his mind was flooded with the darkest thoughts. That night, he could hardly sleep. Every movement of the shadow felt like a hammer striking his consciousness. John felt panic rising within him. He couldn't understand what was happening and why this shadow appeared only in his room. In an attempt to calm himself, he decided it was just a play of light and darkness, but even these thoughts offered no comfort. The next day, John didn't go to work. He couldn't focus on anything other than the shadow. He spent the entire day trying to find an explanation for what was happening, but nothing helped. Fear gripped him, making every sound and every creak in the house suspicious and terrifying. John realized that his mind was beginning to betray him. In the evening of the same day, as dusk began to envelop his home once again, John felt panic growing inside him. He was afraid to enter the bedroom, but he knew he had to. With each step down the hallway, his heart grew heavier. He opened the door and froze on the threshold, unable to believe his eyes. The shadow had grown even larger. Now it covered almost the entire wall, and most frighteningly, it was no longer shapeless. John could make out something that resembled a human figure within it. This figure seemed to stand against the wall, motionless, but at the same time, its presence was so palpable that John felt a cold sweat break out on his skin. John stepped back, unable to take his eyes off the shadow. He felt panic welling up inside him, paralyzing his entire body. Seconds stretched into hours as he stood there, not knowing what to do. He wanted to scream, but the words stuck in his throat. John felt his body begin to tremble with fear, realizing that he could no longer stay here. He ran out of the bedroom and locked the door, as if that could stop the shadow. He knew it was absurd, but fear dictated his every action. John felt he was losing control of himself. His mind was racing with thoughts of leaving the house forever, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the desire to understand what was really happening. That night, John didn't sleep. He sat in the kitchen, holding a cup of cold coffee, listening to every sound in the house. The silence itself seemed menacing, piercing, like a taut string ready to snap at any moment. Every minute was torture, every tick of the clock a hammer on his nerves. In the morning, he realized that this couldn't go on any longer. John decided to seek help. He found an old phone book and began searching for specialists in paranormal phenomena. His skepticism gave way to desperation, and John was ready to believe anything, as long as it could rid him of this terror. After hours of searching, he came across a name that seemed familiar. It was an old professor known in certain circles as an expert in studying anomalies. John decided to call him, not knowing what to expect. He dialed the number, and after several long rings, a calm, tired voice answered on the other end of the line. John briefly described his problem, trying not to leave out any details. The professor was silent, occasionally interjecting with clarifying questions. When John finished, there was a pause on the other end. He felt his tension rising until the professor spoke again, this time with a note of seriousness in his voice. The professor said he needed to inspect the house. John couldn't believe that someone was willing to help. He felt a mix of relief and anxiety. That evening, the professor arrived. He was a short man with gray hair and a piercing gaze. He wasted no time on pleasantries, getting straight to the point. John led him to the bedroom, where the shadow still lingered. The professor approached it, showing no sign of fear. He studied the shadow for a long time, occasionally crouching and muttering to himself. The whole process seemed mystical and even eerie to John. Finally, the professor turned to John and said that this phenomenon was indeed unnatural. The professor explained that shadows could be linked to energy anomalies that sometimes occur in certain places. He said the shadow likely appeared due to some old event that happened in this house. Perhaps someone had died here and their spirit could not find peace. These words sent a shiver down John's spine. However, the professor didn't stop there. He warned John that the shadow might become stronger and more aggressive if no action was taken. According to him, such entities feed on fear and negative energy, and the more John feared, the stronger the shadow became. This explained why the shadow had started to move and grow. John didn't know how to react. His fear had escalated into full-blown panic. He asked the professor what could be done to get rid of this shadow. The professor said there were several ways, but all of them involved some risk. He suggested performing a cleansing ritual that could either banish the entity or make it even stronger. Despite the risk, John agreed. He felt he had no choice. The professor began preparing for the ritual. He placed candles around the room and took out several strange objects that John had never seen before. The air in the room grew heavy, and John felt the tension building around him. The ritual began with the recitation of ancient incantations in an unknown language. The professor moved around the shadow, waving his hands and muttering words that seemed to resonate with the very structure of the house. John stood aside, not taking his eyes off the shadow, which it seemed to him had begun to respond to the professor's actions. The shadow started to quiver as if it were alive. It began to distort, as though resisting the influence of the ritual. At some point, the room filled with a strange sound, a low, resonant hum, as if coming from deep within the earth. John felt his terror intensify. He wanted to scream, but his voice once again failed him. Suddenly, the shadow began to change rapidly. It became denser and seemed to detach from the wall, taking on a three-dimensional form. It was like a nightmare come to life. John couldn't believe his eyes. The shadow slowly elongated, taking on the shape of a human figure. The professor continued chanting incantations, but his voice no longer sounded as confident. A creature that emerged from the shadow took a step forward. John felt his heart skip a beat. He backed away, bumping into the wall. The figure was as dark as the night, with indistinct outlines, but its presence was so intense that it felt as though it was sucking all the air out of the room. Suddenly, the figure froze, as if realizing its power. The silence in the room became unbearable. At that moment, the professor shouted something loudly and sharply, and the figure began to disintegrate like mist dissipating under the sun's rays. It seemed like the final act, but John knew the entity wouldn't disappear so easily. As soon as the shadow vanished, John felt an overwhelming sense of relief. However, the professor looked concerned. He said the ritual was not complete, and the entity could return if not sealed properly. This required time and additional preparations. John was willing to do anything to never see that shadow again. The professor left John with an amulet and several instructions in case the shadow reappeared. He promised to return in a couple of days to complete the ritual. John was exhausted, but there was a glimmer of hope that it was finally over. However, the anxiety still lingered inside him. Over the next few days, John tried to avoid his bedroom. He slept on the couch in the living room, but didn't feel safe even there. It seemed to him that the shadow was watching him from somewhere in the dark corners of the room. This feeling didn't leave him, no matter how hard he tried to convince himself otherwise. When the professor returned, John felt relieved. They performed the final ritual together, sealing the entity and, according to the professor, freeing the house from its presence. But even after that, every time John went to bed, he still felt as if something was hiding in the darkness. And although the shadow never reappeared, the fear stayed with him forever.